working with FEMA to update those flood insurance rate maps. So we were in the middle of that process when Sandy hit, and what FEMA did, as it does after most big storm events, was issue something called advisory-based flood elevation maps, which Bob was mentioning. And these are not the final maps that are going to be in our building code, but they do indicate a lot more of what our current coastal flood risk is today, and they look a lot more like the maps that will be adopted in our building code. So again, it's very hard to see, but we've seen about a doubling of the 100-year floodplain. By the advisories, we now have about 450,000 New Yorkers living in that 100-year floodplain, about 340,000 jobs and about twice as many buildings. So there's really a lot that is at risk of coastal flooding. But I think it's important to remember that's only a really small piece of the story. The first thing to remember is that FEMA's maps are based on historic data, so they don't include any sort of consideration of future sea level rise, future changes in coastal storms that we might see. They also don't talk about any other types of risks. They don't talk about the heavy downpours that we saw shut down the transit system in 2007. They don't talk about the heat waves. We had a July heat wave in 2006 that actually killed about 140 people, which is more than three times the number of people that died during Sandy in New York City, and something that we really, as a city, also need to be thinking about. So, to help us figure out what are the impacts potentially facing the city in the future, as has been mentioned in 2008, we convened, or rather the mayor convened the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and that's a body of leading climate and social scientists that we asked to develop a set of climate projections that would tell us, what are the future hazards facing the city. And you can see that a lot of leading institutions are represented on that. As I mentioned, Klaus is one of our members. So what they did for us was in 2009, they came up with a set of climate projections that we have been using in our planning efforts. And again, it's a little hard to see, but what these projections tell you are we have projections for what we call chronic risks, which are really average changes in different sorts of variables like sea level rise, like temperature and precipitation, but also projections for extreme events, future changes in storm surge as a result of coastal storms, changes in heavy downpours and heat waves. And so as part of the special initiative, we reconvened the New York City Panel on Climate Change and asked them to update these climate projections so that we can make sure that all of the planning efforts that are going on post-Sandy were based on the best available science. So just in conclusion, even though Sandy is unlikely to be exactly recreated in the future, it really was a wake-up call to the city. Even though we had already known that we were vulnerable to coastal flooding as a city with 520 miles of coastline, Sandy and those advisory maps really taught us that we were more at risk than we had thought. We have been working with the NPCC to help us understand that this vulnerability is likely to be a lot greater in the future with climate change, and that it's going to include a lot more than just coastal storms. And then a lot of the analysis that we've been doing, which is going to be forthcoming, is showing that there's a real cost to the city for inaction. So finally, in conclusion, I'll just talk a little bit about what the city's trying to do to address some of these risks. So we've been focused around developing a comprehensive plan that will really act at two levels. The first is to focus on increasing the resilience of our citywide infrastructure and our built environment systems. And there we have teams of folks that are focused really on every type of critical system that we have here in the city, including everything from coastal protection to our hospitals, our power sector, our water and our wastewater, making sure that we've got drinking water and our wastewater treatment plants are working. And then we have, as I mentioned earlier, a team that's focused specifically on how do we rebuild in those communities that were impacted by Sandy in a way that prepares them better for the future. And for those communities, we're focused on the east and south shores of Staten Island, South Brooklyn, southern Queens, the Brooklyn Queens waterfront, and southern Manhattan. And the idea is really to come up with a set of policy recommendations that will help us start to increase resilience, but that are also matched with the types of regulatory changes that we need to be thinking about, tied very specifically to the investments that we need to be making, as well as funding coming from the supplemental that Congress authorized, as well as a number of other funding sources to make sure that we really are going to be implementing these things, and that we have a set of metrics to measure our progress moving forward. So even though the plan's still under development, I thought I would give you a couple of basic principles that we're trying to adhere to in the planning process. So first, the goal is to be ambitious but achievable. We want to be bold in terms of what we can accomplish in increasing resilience for the city, but we also want to make sure that what we're coming up with is implementable. Otherwise, it's not going to move the ball forward. Secondly, we are going to acknowledge that we've got very limited resources and try to stretch those resources as far as we can. We're going to do that through trying to achieve the most benefit we can per dollar spent, and that means that we're thinking about benefits not only in terms of monetary benefits, but also in terms of protecting vulnerable populations and other types of non-monetary considerations that other folks have mentioned. And then lastly, we're focused on really a multi-layered approach that's trying to reduce the impacts in the future where possible, but also focused on reducing the recovery time where impacts do occur. And so that kind of broadly shakes down into three layers. The first focused around coastal protection and reducing damage and also reducing impacts. The second layer is really focused on changes we can make to our built environment to address the most serious potential impacts and also allow people to get back into their homes quickly after an event. And then finally, thinking about our infrastructure and our critical systems and making sure that we have fewer outages, but where we do have outages, again, we've got a faster restoration time. So just in conclusion, to talk a little bit more about the goals for the community plans, we've been focused on really rebuilding in those areas that were impacted by Sandy, as I mentioned. And some of the goals for that work are a few. So we're trying to rebuild what was lost, but using that as an opportunity to re-examine pre-existing issues. So in certain cases, where we can focus on creating economic development and using the recovery as an opportunity for that, we're trying to do so. Secondly, we're also trying to use these impacted areas as laboratories to try to figure out, what are the different strategies and new technologies that work to increase our resilience. And then thirdly, we're focused on bringing together all the different aspects in our citywide resilience plans around coastal protection, around retrofits to buildings, to figure out how they fit together in a context-specific way in different communities. And then finally, we're looking at in the context of very specific local needs, like ongoing recovery of small businesses. So that's a longer tour than you might have wanted of what's going on at the city, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Would you want to ask among yourselves things before we move to the audience? Any dialogue among yourselves at all?
Well, I want to raise one issue that Bob brought up, and in general terms, Leah too. That's the barrier issue.
Which one?
Well, you said that those towns, three of them, Bedford, Providence, and Stanford, have those barriers. That's a slightly different situation because they have sort of a relatively narrow inlet. And so you can, with relatively cheap means, get a lot of effect with New York City being essentially an archipelago, that would be a much more expensive proposition, and it would be the multiple tens of billions of dollars, and we can argue which number is a realistic target here. But there's one additional point that has to be kept in mind, that because of our geography, and I can't get into details, we cannot make those barriers open most of the time and close them only during storms. When we go into the more distant future, meaning somewhere between 2100 and 2200. Why? Because sea level rise sometime in that range, 100, 200 years from now, reaches a level that we reached right now during, let's say, Sandy, as a static condition, and then you have storms on top of that. If that situation comes about, you would have to close the barriers all the time to keep the ocean out. So we would be essentially below the ocean level like New Orleans was. But we have the problem that the Hudson, the Passaic River, and the Raritan River want to get their water out. So we have to open the barriers to let the water out, otherwise we are being flooded from behind the barriers. So if we want to open the barriers, then we get flooded. So the problem is there comes a time horizon, that depends on the sea level rise scenarios that will manifest themselves, where those barriers will be dysfunctional. So we have a limited time as a transition in which they would fulfill function. But then we have to do all the things that we could do right now, or in the near future, during this century. And then we would be sort of better prepared. Also, those barriers would have to function 100% of the time. No flaws. The New Orleans system was recently tested, and sure enough, when they opened and closed one of the barriers, there was an oil leak. Didn't quite, so they haven't yet their approval for that barrier system. So, even barriers are A, not risk-free, and B, they have a limited time. And that's where our cost-benefit analysis that the city is planning to do, and which our Corps of Engineers is going to do, will really shed some light on it, whether it's worthwhile doing it or not.
See, I agree with you. Ordinarily, one of the mottos at RPA is that there are no silver bullets. Typically, when somebody comes in and says, just do this one thing, it's usually time to hang on to the wall. Because it usually is just one thing. I agree with you that this is not the only thing that you do. I'm just suggesting that we should take a look at it. And if you told me, we concluded that somewhere between 2100 and 2200 we got to move to Plan B, I would say let's put a note in the file to our successors and tell them to keep an eye on this one. Somewhere around 2100, take a fresh look at what you're going to do. It's very interesting. See, you and I both live in coastal communities. We have both chosen different strategies. I live in a house, a 100-year-old house that is 50 feet up from the water. Okay, and I really have some guys down on the beach in front of me, and I've threatened to start, the International Association for the Advancement of Sea Level Rise, because I'm looking forward to cleaning up the houses. Waterfront life would be grand. Told the kids, hang on to the house, And you're talking about elevating your property. We're both very prudent individuals in our own way and so forth, and we're pretty capable of figuring out how to manage risk. So what we need to do is to look at how, take a very long view. And that's what you're saying, is that this is not something that you do in an afternoon, or we got this quick fix, we just do this one thing, and all of a sudden it takes care of all of our problems. Because, I guess I started by saying we have a very diverse set of community types. We have a very diverse set of landscape types. We have very different kinds of vulnerabilities in different parts of the city and different parts of the region. And there will not be any one-size-fits-all solutions. If we concluded, and all I'm suggesting is that we ought to push the Corps of Engineers to take a serious look at what a barrier system might look at. You know, it's interesting to see that the New St. Petersburg barrier, which is 3 times the size of the barrier that you have here, you know, it's a different, you know, every place is different, but similar shallow water, similar 300-foot wide dredge shipping channel and so forth. And so they decided to do it there, and it's and they've already avoided some flooding events and so forth. So I'm saying let's take a look at that as an option. Let's understand how much protection it gives us. Let's understand how you deal with the unique geography of this region. You know, we do have this little lake called the Hudson River, which is, you know,
And we have topography,
and we
highlands,
yeah, that's right. And so
which Petersburg and the Netherlands and Venice don't have.
well, those are
Nor New Orleans.
but those are advantages too, you know, because
Yeah.
you don't have to protect everything. And so anyway, so I'm saying let's take a look at what that would be. Let's keep an open mind about how much it would cost compared with what the benefits might be. You know, one of the things we learned is that when you shut down the subway system, even if you don't have flooding in it, or even if you plan to take, you know, do the prudent things that the MTA did, you know, taking the electrical components out and switches out and so forth, and then putting them back in again. The reality is that it takes 3 days to shut the thing down, have it be closed, and crank it up again. And, you know, we have a $1.5 trillion economy in this region. One of the things that we learned is when you shut down the subway system, the traffic jams start in Ronkonkoma and in Poughkeepsie and in someplace in central New Jersey because hundreds of thousands of commuter rail and subway passengers drive to work. And our highways doesn't take a natural disaster to shut down the Jersey Turnpike. It takes a heavy duty, you know, because it's at 110% of capacity. So you figure it out, it's about $3 billion a day just to have the economy be shut down. Well,
That's how we estimated actually the indirect cost from the subway. We
So-
came out with $50 billion.
Yeah, all right. And so at any rate, so you say, well, we just had a $50 billion storm, and that was just one storm. And it might be $15 or $20 billion to build a barrier system, and I would say, well, maybe you ought to look at that as a prudent alternative. If we were in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, and we had a GDP for the GRP for the region of, $50 million, I'd say absolutely no way. Better put houses up on stilts, and better plan to evacuate people better. But we actually have a nice $1.5 trillion economy. We could afford to do things if it turns out that they are cost effective and prudent and effective. And again, beware of anybody telling you there's only one thing, because we know we got to do a bunch of different things to safeguard the 8.3 million people who live in the city.
It's interesting that you mentioned the barriers, that the 3 barriers that were built in the region.
Yeah.
That they were built in response to the high storm frequency decade of the 1950s and 60s.
Yes.
Because there is data that indicates that there are certain factors in the Atlantic right now that make the East Coast more vulnerable to tropical storms and hurricanes. It definitely suggests that for this particular year, and has shown we're in a more active period in general. Doesn't mean that New York City is going to get hit every single year.
What
Let's
kind
hope
of
not.
factors in Atlantic?
In terms of the location of the warmest pool of water, the main development region of tropical storms, there's a cyclical nature that the Atlantic goes through in terms of when there are higher periods of activity for tropical storms and hurricanes, and we happen to be in an active phase. We have been for quite a while. It only takes one storm though, so an inactive phase doesn't necessarily mean that's great. It only takes one big impact. Hurricane Andrew, for example, in '92 was a very low storm count year, but that storm will long be remembered. Sadly, the name Andrew was retired after that. But the other point that came to mind when you were talking about some of the implications of shutting the subway system down, communication about the risks and the choices that we're facing, communication is key. Communication was key in the run-up to the storm and helping people make individual choices about what they were going to do, whether they were going to stay or whether they were going to go and who evacuates. And the meteorological community got the forecast right for sanity. They pegged the storm surge correctly in New York City. They did everything right, but the communication of the forecast had many, many shortcomings. There was no single federal website to go to for information. The National Hurricane Center website did not have the local storm statements for New York.
Because it stopped being a
Right, because
hurricane.
they changed it to a post-tropical cyclone, and we spent more time talking about what is a post-tropical cyclone versus a hurricane, when really what we should have been talking about were the impacts that the storm was going to have. And, you know, in a report that was released about a week ago from NOAA, found that there were miscommunications between NOAA and the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management in New York, where the storm surge forecast for New York was underestimated on Saturday and then corrected for Sunday, and that's why you saw the whiplash from no, it's not going to be as bad as Irene and we're not ordering evacuations on Saturday at the Mayor's press conference to full-blown mobilization on Sunday, which was not exactly a lot of lead time before the storm for all the evacuations to take place. So, you know, from the journalism standpoint, the challenge of accurately communicating the risk that this area faces is just a particularly pressing one and interesting one.
So, one big finding then is that the National Hurricane Center, you know, they shouldn't all just pack it up and go out for a beer
When they pass it on,
when
yeah.
they pass it on to the local weather bureau and tell them have a nice day.
Well, they said that the Hurricane Center actually called the Office of Emergency Management on Saturday night after they saw Bloomberg's press conference, and they said, we're a little concerned. Getting that phone call was a little eye-opening for the office because they were dealing with the National Weather Service office in Long Island because the Hurricane Center had passed off.
It's interesting, there's actually another office within NOAA, the National Weather Service, that deals with extratropical storms, and their forecasts were very good too, except they're not probabilistic, they're deterministic, but their deterministic forecast was right on the nose. But nobody knows about
And
that.
nobody paid any attention.
And, well, the public doesn't know. I mean, I know it because I'm an expert, you know, so I know which website that is on, and I use it every day. So I put my refrigerator and my dishwasher up on the kitchen counter.
So one of our early warning devices is like a video camera in your kitchen. Actually moving the furniture up, it's tied up.
More importantly, I put all my equipment, hot water, heating, everything, into the attic in 2003.
Is it true that you're the only man in the tri-state region that has the dishwasher above the counters and not below? It's true, isn't it?
I would like to, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, I do think risk communication is pretty critical, and I know that NOAA has already been making moves to correct a lot of those problems, so hopefully this next hurricane season, which is starting next week, we won't
This is
see,
very timely here too.
You know,
Yeah.
We just have to hope that they're not on furlough that week.
But I think another thing that was interesting during the storm is that actually the built environment has something to do with whether people go or whether people stay as well. I mean, we did see people who were, you know, had garages that were subterranean, and they were very worried about their houses getting damaged and actually stayed behind to protect their possessions. So it's not just as simple as risk communication. We also have to start thinking about other things that we can do as a city to make sure that people really do get the message and that you know, we're helping them get out of harm's way. I think that's a big challenge that we have facing us.
We had a problem too with, you know, the sequence of these storms. We had Irene with evacuation orders, and then it was a dud, right? And then a lot of people thought that, well, we evacuated last time, we didn't need to, so this time we'll just hang out here and maybe hold a hurricane party and have a good time and so forth. And it was devastating for a lot of places because of that.
Yeah,
I want to be sure, be sure to let people ask questions here, so, and we can come back, but I want to be sure people can, I can hardly see you out there, as I'm in glaring light, Are there questions you'd like to ask? Yes, please.
We've been talking a lot about the built environment and technical solutions. And I'm curious, in the long range, not in the short range, what can we do? Is there some, I mean, all of the talk of greenhouse gases, global warming, et cetera, we've been talking as if it's all a fait accompli. And that cannot be reversed. So I'd love to hear anybody speak about that. Is there, is it too late? I mean, so now everything is about as much prevention as we can and as, you know.
I certainly can speak a little bit about it. I'm sure there are others too. Well, we have already front-loaded our cannon with CO2 that even if we were to stop today, which of course is highly impossible, there would be several hundred years of global warming and related sea level rise in the making. But how we proceed from now into the future is extraordinarily important. Where the CO2 will stabilize eventually, and that sea level rise will not accelerate ad infinitum into the future. I mean, in the worst case, you get Greenland and West Antarctica and eventually Antarctica involved more heavily in contributing to sea level rise. We have to be very adamant as a global community to do something about it. The problem is we all have to understand we are on the same earth. So if New York is doing something, that wouldn't help. If the United States alone is doing something, it wouldn't help. We need China, we need India, Brazil, Indonesia, and the other big population centers, meaning also development nations, developing nations, pitch in on that. As we know, the United States itself was not exactly a model for international cooperation on that so far. And so it's hard to beat on the Chinese if we don't sign up on a Kyoto Protocol or anything. So there will be pressures eventually, I think, from the business community to do something about it, because business community will feel the effects.
I mean, so, I think we absolutely feel in the city that we have, responsibility to continue to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We have a commitment to reduce our emissions 30% by 2030, and we're more than halfway towards that goal. And we're also thinking more broadly about reducing emissions 80% by 2050, which is what scientists, the global science community has broadly said is what we need to do to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change. But, as Klaus points out, we're one city, we should be doing our part, but others have to follow along as well.
But it's not impossible. Your point, Klaus, is that there are probably a dozen or 15 industrialized countries that have to sign on to something. And you could address 80% of the problem if you got certainly the G20. You got the so it's not getting 120 countries to agree to something. It's getting, a dozen or 15 or 20 countries to agree to something. And that's, so that has to happen. The focus of tonight's discussion was adaptation, was dealing with the changes that we know have already occurred or likely to happen, regardless of what we do to restrain further carbon production. We have to do both things. And it is also very interesting to see that, and this is where the mayor's C40 initiative, where he, not waiting for the United Nations or for the United States government to do it, but just getting the mayors of 40 of the biggest cities in the world together. And it's a remarkable share of the carbon in the world that can be and is beginning to be reduced because of this volunteer, this little club that the city of New York helped convene and helped staff and so forth. So there are things that we can do and are doing. We just have got to be really vigilant, about accelerating those efforts. We've got to do both things. Otherwise, buy waterfront property in Brattleboro, or something, because, we start to see forecasts of, hundreds of feet of sea level rise, and no barrier, no amount of, that means that puts the whole East Coast, the population centers of the whole East Coast underwater. That's a disaster, and by the way, of every other industrialized country, which is why, we need to get motivated about this. This is not just the business community, this is anybody that cares about our civilization has to be concerned about it.
Well, let me ask something now too, since we're a public radio station. What do you think the media should be doing, particularly the public?
Turn down the lights on the radio station
Well, I mean,
Starters, just.
the media should do what WNYC is doing.
We're doing enough of it.
Well, I think talk to the best players in town and beyond that really have the facts at their fingertips. Talk to the leaders, talk to my colleagues on the NPCC, talk to, those who have shown act as model protagonists in this whole game, and it's a very serious game. So I think if you set the example, and there have been wonderful programs that I have heard both on WNYC and NPR in general, that really, for instance, Andrea Bernstein put really the heat on New Jersey Transit, the other day. Now, that's the kind of tough reporting that has to take place to wake up people and maybe shake up people.
There's also an element, I come from an organization that published some of the largest numbers of climate change related news stories of any other publication last year. Or at least, I think myself and another reporter were the number 1 and 2 people. I have no idea if anybody read us, but I was very busy. So I think that part of it too is figuring out what narratives resonate with people and what narratives get around the political divisions and the cognitive factors that we don't even know we all have that help us perceive threat-related information and risk-related information. So when you communicate a particular climate change story to a certain audience, different people are going to hear different things even though they heard the same thing. And there's a whole scientific community that is increasingly looking at this and trying to finally, first it was just, oh, you guys have a communication problem, we're going to go write about it in our scientific journals and tell you that you're doing everything wrong but not tell you how to fix it. And now there's increasingly linkages between academics and journalists, and Climate Central is one of the organizations that's trying to sort of bring the two together to try to figure out what are ways that we can communicate the climate science issue that gets this across in ways that people understand and maybe motivates them to act in whatever way they see fit. This American Life did a full hour on climate change this past weekend. I've yet to listen to it, but I've seen the way they divided the segments, and they talked to a state climatologist in Colorado about the local impacts that person is seeing, and how he didn't initially believe it was man-made, human-related climate change, but now he doesn't really see any alternative for what's happening out there. They talked to activist Bill McKibben, who started 350.org, who's leading the activism against the Keystone Pipeline. McKibben is all about giving this issue an enemy, and the enemy being the fossil fuel industry. And then, I forget what the other segment was, but one thing that I think I mentioned to you on the phone when we talked is, there are really interesting spokespeople for climate change that you don't think of, that are actually communicating on climate, but we don't realize they are. Some of the most powerful op-eds on climate that I've seen come from farmers who are writing to their local newspaper being like, I don't know what to plant anymore, I don't know how to deal with this risk, and there's actually companies that are making increasing amounts of money helping the farming community in the United States manage climate risk and give them software tools and other tools. Because they're just seeing these huge swings between flooding and drought and extreme heat. And last year was the hottest year on record in the United States, with the hottest month ever in the United States was July of last year. So it's trying to figure out ways to talk about the issue that we haven't done much of yet, that don't spark the right versus left divide on this issue, which is just incredibly frustrating to deal with.
Anyone else up there? I see in the back, yeah.
Yeah, I think that Bobby or yourself or Leah may be best able to answer this one. So whatever price tag comes along with wide adoption of a more resilient mindset on building is going to be pretty staggeringly high. Is there anything that the city or the region in general are doing to look at more innovative ways of spending money on the things that we know we're going to have to spend money on anyway to help bring those costs down? I mean, it was commented some years ago in Congress that thank God that roads break up all the time because it's great for jobs bills. I mean, is there anything that's being done to look at alternative building or materials costs on a governmental end so that there's a few more dollars for resiliency issues?
There's a lot of creative thinking going on, here in the city and around the region about different design solutions to simple things like rebuilding boardwalks and revetments. And a lot of the stuff that Klaus mentioned, is incredibly, brilliant, high cost solution to the problem of what to do about his dishwasher was to put it on top of the counter. This is, we don't need a commission to figure that one out. That's pretty interesting. And so I think there's some low-tech solutions. I mean, I know we ran a busload of town officials out to Long Branch, New Jersey, to take a look at the one piece of the Jersey Shore which was engineered with a boardwalk and dune system and a development pattern that pulled the development back, from the velocity zone, from the wave zone, and then basically designed the dunes and the boardwalk so that the water was designed to go in and go out again without tearing the hell out of everything. And with the idea that there's some very simple design solutions that can avoid big ticket rebuilding programs in the future. Now, I don't know how many, nobody's mandated that we adopt these new standards, but this is, I think, at the heart of what the city is doing, is to make sure that, we may not get another, $60 billion check from the federal government if this happens again a year or two or three from now. So what the city is doing is making sure that the money that we get now is invested in ways that really maximizes the long-term benefits, that avoids, stupid design solutions and so forth, things that we know don't work. So, and I think that's going on around the region. The state of New York is doing the same thing now with a program to provide technical assistance using some of the Sandy funds to communities to help individual communities adopt zoning and building standards and design standards that basically take best practices and apply them across the region. It's not being mandated, but it's something that the state's providing, basically free money to communities to do that, and technical support from very talented group of consultants to help the towns get it right. So I think a lot of that's going on. We're not dumb, and we got some very smart public officials who've learned a lot from these events. I mean, Andrew Cuomo, was really chasing. It was interesting talking to him after Sandy. Because down here in New York, we think, well, it's just Sandy, but it was Irene just whacked the Catskills and the Adirondacks and the Mohawk Valley, and then there were a series there were droughts in western New York. There were, it was like he had a half dozen of these things in the first 18 months of being governor of New York, and so he made it very clear to everybody in state government and everybody involved in the various commissions. There were 3 of them that he created. One for what to do this afternoon, one for what to do in the next 6 months or before the next hurricane season. third one, the 2100 Commission, long range, made it very clear to everybody that he was looking for some common sense approaches and cost-effective approaches to preventing this kind of thing from, you can't prevent it from happening again. What you can do is you can prepare communities and you can mitigate future damage. And so I think a lot of that thinking has happened at the state level, it's happening certainly at the city level, and I think in communities across the state.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I mean, I would say a couple things that we learned from the storm maybe that I didn't focus on are, one is that we know a lot of the solutions already that work, and there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. We have a lot of buildings here in the city that were built prior to any sort of flood protection standards, and, you know, we think that there are a lot of things that we can do to really increase the resilience of a lot of our existing building stock. You know, I think as Bob was mentioning, you saw a lot of that still water flooding happening up in lower Manhattan. Those aren't areas by and large that are going to be subject to a lot of intense wave action. In some cases, doing simple things like elevating mechanicals and electricals are going to be the thing that does the trick, or at least, you know, drastically reduces damage. Second, we are trying to work as a city. We've already put a few things in place to help incentivize some of this stuff through the rebuilding process. So one of the things that we've done is we've passed an executive order in our zoning resolution that gives people the option, basically removes penalties and allows them to rebuild back to higher standards if they want to. Very soon, we're going to be having our CDBG, or Community Development Block Grant funding, that's launched as part of the special initiative plan, and that's going to include incentives to help people do those sorts of things. Is it going to be enough money? No, definitely not. But we do want to make sure that when the next storm comes, we're at least in better shape than we were last time around. And then I think probably the third thing is that because of some of the insurance reforms that Bob was mentioning earlier, just living in some of these areas is going to become, you know, by default, a lot more expensive for folks if they don't start to do some of these things. The way flood insurance is going to start to be priced is it's going to reflect supposedly your actual risk. So you will be paying a penalty if you don't start to do some of those things. And I didn't mention it, but part of the report is focused around insurance and trying to make sure that the policies that the federal government has in place actually make sense and actually align with a lot of the things that we think we can do to make ourselves safer.
Well, that's a job in itself, but,
Yeah, if I may, just add one thought. You started your comment with saying this will cost a big bundle of money, or whatever you said. Well, the question is, can we afford not to spend this bundle of money? Because if we don't, we will spend a bigger bundle of money over decades at least. So there was a study, I was part of it in the early 2000s or so, by the National Institute of Building Science. They looked across all the hazards, not just storm surges and river flooding, earthquakes, everything. And we came out with the result that for every $1 you spend on these adaptation, protective, whatever measures, you get about $4 back in not incurred losses. That's a 4-to-1 ratio. We cannot afford to spend that $1. We have to, in order to avoid the $4 losses. And that's a very important lesson to be learned. The problem is that usually the human psychology doesn't like to spend money on not losing. Everybody wants to spend the money on winning. Okay? But that's a psychology, that's a communication issue. At the bottom line, it's good to invest into these adaptation and protective measures.
Hey, I need to point out one thing, Joyce, that my little unpleasant comment about WNYC and its lighting practices is that all of these lights are LEDs up here, so that the station actually in designing this space thought about this, and not all of them, but most of them, I suspect that a lot of these could be retrofitted. So, WNYC has already begun to take the kinds of actions that we all need to take to reduce our personal carbon footprints. And I think publicizing what you're doing, moving to the next level, could be very important to help people understand what they can do.
This was not a paid announcement?
No, it's okay, I'm just looking around here at all the LEDs.
Well, it's a
Pretty
green
cool.
space.
Yeah, there it is, it's a green space, yeah.
Are there other questions back there, Steve?
Unfortunately, just the idea that climate change exists has been politically contentious. I'm wondering how much is that really holding back progress, and also what do you tell people when they say other institutions?
Well, I really like Kevin Burke's approach, which is just to say, look, we can debate whether it's man-made or not. Apparently some people don't believe it, despite pretty convincing evidence to that effect. But what he said was, look, let's not debate what's causing it. Let's just understand that the world is changing, that the climate is changing. And it's changing all over the world. It's changing all over the United States. And so then let's focus on what prudent people will do, whether they're farmers in Kansas or whether they're coastal property owners in Brooklyn or what have you, or somebody with a public housing project in the Rockaways. There's some things that you have to do that are just the prudent things to look after your family, to look after your community, to look after your business, your livelihood, and so forth. And I like that approach. I mean, Kevin, he's a very serious, not conservative, but he's a middle of the road business leader. He just said, let's just skip all this other stuff, and then we can have that. Somebody else can have that debate. Let's just focus on what prudent people need to do. And I like that approach. Then we can step away from all the other BS. I think it's what it is, but let's just stay clear of it and focus on the things that individuals can do, communities can do, cities can do, and so forth.
We know we don't need climate change. We are already exposed to risk levels right now that are actually intolerable. And climate change, whether you believe it or not, will only make it worse. But let's take care of the risks that we already are exposed to and that we know that we're exposed to. And that would go a long way that when the climate change comes about, and will come about, believe me, then we are somewhat better prepared. Not sufficiently prepared, but somewhat better.
There's another question, that probably good, yes.
I've been going to a lot of meetings like this for a while. I think about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, we discussed everybody would be using sustainable. But tonight, it's resiliency. Could you explain that difference?
Well, I think that there's still a broad community and push for being more sustainable and for sustainable development, which in different contexts means different things. The comment about the lighting system and reducing energy use is probably more of a sustainability approach than it is resilience. This panel, I think, is focused more on resilience just because we're talking about a post-Sandy situation and how to better prepare us. But I think the broader context of how climate change as an issue has evolved in the United States and maybe worldwide to some extent over the past several years is we've really gone from a debate between those who said we want to talk about adaptation and those who said we can only talk about mitigation to more of a focus on greening everything and on sustainability to a focus now on adaptation, mitigation, resiliency, and sustainability. And we need to be talking about and doing all sorts of different approaches. I think resiliency is really the buzzword in a climate adaptation context and in just an extreme weather context, whether it's altered by long-term climate change or not. And getting at your question just a little bit in terms of how much is the divide on climate change holding things back. The public opinion polling is pretty consistent that the majority of Americans believe that global warming is occurring and that it's most likely man-made. There is a majority there. What there isn't is a majority clamoring for action and calling their lawmakers.